At a family dinner, my guardians casually mentioned that my cousin would be moving in with me. I just let them talk. They had no idea I had already moved to a new condo they knew nothing about. I, 26M, sat at the familiar dining table where I'd eaten thousands of meals over the past 18 years. Watching my guardians pass around the mashed potatoes like this was just another normal Sunday dinner. The irony wasn't lost on me that they were about to make an announcement that would reveal just how little they actually knew about the person they'd raised. My aunt, who'd been my legal guardian since I was 8, cleared her throat in that way she always did before delivering news she thought was particularly important. Her husband, my uncle, nodded along as she began explaining how my cousin had just graduated college and needed a place to stay while he got on his feet. She mentioned how it would be perfect since I had that nice 2-bedroom apartment downtown, and how family should help family. I kept eating my pot roast, nodding occasionally, letting them paint their little picture of how the next few months would unfold. They talked about how my cousin could take the spare bedroom, how he'd probably only need to stay for 6 months or so, how it would be good for both of us to have company. My uncle even mentioned how they'd already told my cousin he could move in next weekend. The audacity was breathtaking. Not once did they ask if this arrangement worked for me. Not once did they consider that I might have plans of my own. They simply assumed that because they'd raised me, because they'd given me a home when my parents died, that I would forever be grateful enough to say yes to whatever they asked. And maybe 6 months ago, they would have been right. I finished my dinner while they continued planning my life, discussing logistics like I wasn't even there. My aunt mentioned how she'd help my cousin pack, how they'd use her SUV to move his stuff. My uncle suggested that I should probably clear out some closet space and maybe get an air mattress in case my cousin had friends visit. When dessert came around, my aunt asked if I was okay with everything. I told her it sounded fine, that we'd figure it out. The relief on her face was almost comical. She reached over and patted my hand, telling me how proud she was of how mature and family-oriented I'd become. I drove home that night to my apartment, the apartment they thought I still lived in, the apartment where they expected my cousin to show up with his belongings in 6 days. I sat in my car for a few minutes, looking up at the windows of the place that had been my home for 3 years, the place I'd officially moved out of 2 weeks ago. The timing couldn't have been more perfect. 3 months earlier, I'd received news that changed everything. The life insurance payout from my parents' death, which had been held in trust until I turned 25, had finally been released to me. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough to put a substantial down payment on a condo across town, in a building my guardians had never visited, in a neighborhood they rarely drove through. I'd been planning my exit strategy for months, but I hadn't been planning revenge. That came later, when I started paying attention to the pattern of behavior that had defined my entire relationship with my guardians. The apartment they were so casually offering to my cousin? They'd co-signed the lease when I was 22 and struggling to establish credit. For 3 years, they'd held that over my head whenever I didn't fall in line with their expectations. They'd remind me how they'd stuck their necks out for me, how I owed them, how family loyalty worked both ways. When I wanted to switch majors in college, they'd threatened to stop helping with rent. When I'd dated someone they didn't approve of, they'd shown up unannounced to check on the apartment, claiming they were just making sure I was taking care of their investment. When I'd gotten a better job and wanted to celebrate by taking a weekend trip with friends, they'd guilt-trip me about being financially irresponsible. Every major decision in my adult life had been filtered through their approval, their opinions, their sense of what I should or shouldn't do. And I'd gone along with it because I felt like I owed them everything. But sitting in that car, looking up at the apartment they thought they still had control over, I realized something important. Gratitude had an expiration date, and mine had run out the moment they decided to move someone into my home without asking. Over the next week, I watched the situation unfold like a slow-motion car crash that I was directing from a safe distance. My cousin called me Tuesday night to thank me for letting him stay with me. He sounded genuinely grateful, which almost made me feel bad about what was coming. He explained how he'd been stressed about finding a place he could afford, how my aunt had told him I was excited to have a roommate. He asked about house rules and offered to pay a portion of the utilities. I told him we'd talk about all that when he got settled in. Wednesday evening, my aunt called to coordinate the move-in details. She asked if Saturday morning worked for me, around 10 o'clock. She mentioned that she'd already arranged to borrow my uncle's truck in addition to her SUV because my cousin had more stuff than they'd initially thought. I told her Saturday morning was perfect. Thursday, my cousin texted asking if I had any preferences about grocery shopping or cleaning schedules. He seemed like a decent kid, which made this whole situation even more infuriating. If my guardians had just asked, if they'd treated me like an adult capable of making my own decisions, I probably would have said yes. Instead, they'd created this mess through their assumption that I would always be their grateful, compliant ward. Friday night, I drove by my old apartment building and saw my uncle's truck parked outside, loaded with boxes and furniture. They were getting an early start, probably planning to surprise me with how organized and helpful they were being. Saturday morning at 9:30, I drove to my favorite coffee shop, the one that was 15 minutes away from my old apartment and had a perfect view of the parking lot. I ordered a large coffee and settled in by the window. At exactly 10 o'clock, the convoy arrived. My aunt's SUV, my uncle's truck, and my cousin's sedan, all pulling into the parking lot of my former residence. I watched them get out, stretching and organizing themselves for the big move. My aunt was clearly in charge, directing traffic and pointing toward the building entrance. I took a sip of my coffee and pulled out my phone. By 10:15, my phone was ringing. My aunt, sounding confused, asking where I was. She mentioned that they were at my apartment, but I wasn't answering the door. I told her I was running errands and would be back soon, asking if everything was okay. She explained the situation, how they'd brought all of my cousin's stuff and were standing in the parking lot, unable to get into the building. I suggested they call the landlord. Maybe there was some confusion with the keys. 20 minutes later, my uncle called. He'd spoken to the landlord, who'd informed them that I'd moved out 2 weeks ago and the apartment was being prepared for new tenants. He wanted to know what was going on, why I hadn't told them I was moving. I feigned surprise, telling him that was strange, asking if he was sure he had the right address. Maybe there was some paperwork mix-up? I suggested he double-check with the landlord. By 11 o'clock, all three of them were calling me repeatedly. My cousin sounded panicked, asking where he was supposed to live. My aunt was demanding answers. My uncle was threatening to drive around the city looking for me. I finished my coffee, got back in my car, and drove to my new condo. The building was beautiful, a converted warehouse in the arts district with exposed brick walls and floor-to-ceiling windows. I'd fallen in love with it the moment I'd seen it, but more importantly, it represented something my guardians had never given me: complete independence. I called my aunt back around noon. She immediately launched into a tirade about how irresponsible I was being, how I'd humiliated them in front of my cousin, how they couldn't understand why I'd moved without telling them. She demanded my new address so they could bring my cousin's stuff to the right place. I let her finish, then calmly explained that there seemed to be some misunderstanding. I told her I'd never agreed to let my cousin move in with me. I'd simply listened to their plans and nodded politely, but I'd never actually consented to the arrangement. The silence on the other end of the phone was deafening. When she finally spoke, her voice was cold with anger. She reminded me of everything they'd done for me, how they'd raised me when no one else would, how they'd co-signed my lease and helped me through college. She accused me of being ungrateful and selfish. I told her she was absolutely right about one thing. They had done a lot for me, and I was grateful. But gratitude didn't mean I had to give up my right to make decisions about my own life. I explained that if they'd asked me instead of telling me, we might have worked something out. But they'd chosen to treat me like a child who couldn't be trusted with adult conversations. My uncle got on the phone and tried a different approach. He asked where I was living now, offering to help me move my cousin's stuff to the new place. When I declined, he started bargaining. Maybe my cousin could just stay for a month? A few weeks? Surely I could help family for just a little while. I told him I understood their position, but my new living situation wasn't suitable for a roommate. I suggested they check local rental listings or extended stay hotels. Update 1. The fallout was immediate and exactly what I'd expected. By Sunday morning, I'd received texts from various relatives, all expressing disappointment in my behavior. My aunt had apparently spent Saturday evening making phone calls, painting me as an ungrateful nephew who'd abandoned family in their time of need. My cousin found a temporary situation, staying with a friend from college while he looked for his own place. He sent me a polite but clearly hurt message, saying he understood I had my reasons but wished I'd been upfront with him. That message hit harder than all the others combined. He was right. He didn't deserve to be caught in the middle of this. But I also knew that if I'd tried to explain the situation to him beforehand, the information would have gotten back to my guardians, and they would have found a way to manipulate the situation. For 2 weeks, I heard nothing from my aunt and uncle. Then my aunt called, her voice carefully controlled, asking if we could meet for lunch to discuss things calmly. I agreed, curious to see what approach they'd take. We met at a restaurant halfway between my old neighborhood and my new one, neutral territory. My aunt had clearly prepared for this conversation. She apologized for not asking my permission before making plans, acknowledged that they should have handled things differently. But then came the real reason for the lunch. She wanted to know about my financial situation. How had I afforded to move to a new place so suddenly? Where was I getting the money for rent and deposits? She seemed genuinely confused about how I'd managed this transition without their knowledge or help. I explained about the insurance money, watching her face change as she processed this information. I could see her mental calculations, her realization that I'd been sitting on this money for months without telling them. She asked why I'd kept it a secret, and I told her the truth, because I'd known they would have opinions about how I should spend it. They would have wanted input on where I lived, what I bought, how much I saved. I'd wanted to make these decisions independently, as an adult should be able to do. The conversation grew tense as she accused me of being deceptive and manipulative. I pointed out that planning my cousin's living situation without consulting me was also deceptive and manipulative. She argued that family was different, that they'd earned the right to expect certain things from me. I asked her what exactly they'd earned. Yes, they'd raised me, but that had been their choice. They'd received compensation from the state for fostering me, and later from my parents' estate for guardianship expenses. They'd provided a home, but they'd also benefited from tax deductions and social recognition for their generosity. Most importantly, I reminded her that good parenting wasn't supposed to be transactional. You don't raise a child so you can control them as an adult. She left the restaurant angry, but I could tell I'd given her things to think about. Update 2. 3 months passed with minimal contact. I heard through the family grapevine that my cousin had found a good apartment and was doing well at his new job. My guardians had apparently helped him with the security deposit, which told me they'd always had the resources to solve the problem. They'd just preferred to use mine. I thought the drama was over until my uncle showed up at my condo building one evening in November. The building had secure access, so he couldn't get upstairs, but he waited in the lobby until I came home from work. He looked older than I remembered, tired in a way that went beyond physical exhaustion. He asked if we could talk, and something in his demeanor made me agree to let him upstairs. My condo was beautiful, decorated with furniture I'd chosen myself, filled with art and books that reflected my actual interests rather than what my guardians thought was appropriate. He walked around slowly, taking it all in, and I could see him processing the reality of my independence. He sat down on my couch and told me he'd been doing a lot of thinking since our last conversation. He said my aunt was still angry, still convinced that I'd betrayed them, but he was starting to understand my perspective. He asked me if I'd been planning this for a long time, if I'd been pretending to be grateful while secretly resenting them. The question was fair, and I gave him an honest answer. I explained that my resentment had been building for years, but it wasn't about ingratitude. It was about being treated like a permanent child, like someone who couldn't be trusted to make adult decisions. I told him about all the times they'd overruled my choices, all the ways they'd used their authority to maintain control over my life. He listened without interrupting, nodding occasionally, and when I finished, he was quiet for a long time. Finally, he said something that surprised me. He admitted they'd probably held on too tightly, that they'd been afraid of letting me make mistakes because they'd already lost my parents and couldn't bear the thought of losing me too. He said their controlling behavior had come from love, but he could see now how it had felt suffocating. He asked what it would take for us to have a relationship again. I told him I didn't need an apology for their parenting choices. Those had been made with good intentions. But I needed respect for my autonomy as an adult. I needed them to ask instead of assuming, to accept my decisions even when they disagreed with them. Most importantly, I needed them to understand that gratitude and compliance weren't the same thing. He said he'd talk to my aunt, that maybe they could work on changing how they interacted with me. But he also warned me that she might never fully accept this new dynamic, that she might always see my independence as a rejection of their family. I told him I hoped that wouldn't be the case, but I couldn't live my life trying to manage other people's expectations anymore. He left that night with a handshake and a promise to stay in touch. Over the following months, he kept that promise. He'd text occasionally, asking how I was doing, but never demanding details. He'd invite me to family events, but accept gracefully when I declined. My aunt took longer to come around, but eventually, she began reaching out too. Our interactions were stilted at first, carefully polite, but gradually they became more natural. Update 3. A year later, I hosted Thanksgiving dinner in my condo. It wasn't a grand gesture of reconciliation. I'd simply realized that I enjoyed cooking and had the space to entertain. I invited my guardians, my cousin, and a few other relatives, making it clear that this was my gift to them, not an obligation. The evening went better than I'd expected. My aunt complimented my cooking and asked genuine questions about my job and hobbies. My uncle helped with dishes and thanked me for hosting. My cousin brought wine and seemed to have completely moved past our awkward beginning. As people were leaving, my aunt pulled me aside. She said she was proud of how I'd built my life, how I'd created something beautiful and independent. She admitted that watching me host dinner in my own home had made her realize I truly was an adult, capable of making good decisions. Then she said something that meant more to me than any apology. She asked if I needed anything, if there was any way she could support what I was building. For the first time in my adult life, she was offering help without strings attached, without expectations of control or compliance in return. I told her I was doing fine on my own, but I appreciated the offer. And I meant it. The whole experience taught me something important about revenge. I thought I was getting back at them by deceiving them about my move, by letting them show up to an empty apartment with all my cousin's belongings. And maybe in the moment, there had been some satisfaction in watching their assumptions crumble. But the real victory hadn't been in humiliating them. It had been in proving to myself that I could build a life entirely on my own terms. The revenge was living well, independently, without needing their approval or permission. Sometimes the best way to win a power struggle is to stop playing the game entirely. Sometimes the most effective rebellion is simply growing up and moving on. My guardians had raised me to be grateful, and I was. But I learned that true gratitude doesn't require sacrificing your autonomy. You can appreciate what someone has given you while still insisting on your right to make your own choices. That Sunday dinner conversation, where they'd casually announced my cousin would be moving in with me, had been the last time they made unilateral decisions about my life. Not because I'd fought them or argued with them, but because I'd quietly removed myself from their sphere of control. In the end, the most powerful thing I could do wasn't to seek revenge, it was to build something better.